All right, so this is part 2 of this wonderful chat with Kapil. This time we're going to chat more about spirituality and sexuality and the intersection between spiritual and sexual practices. So this is going to be a juicy episode. I suggest we begin with your experiences, and we've touched on a little bit before how you were raised spiritual, but I would love for you to expand on your spiritual path. How did you start and how did it progress?
You know, it's funny because I didn't think of it as a spiritual path. As I said, the two questions for me, one was I wanted to be better at relationships. I wanted to be better with women. And the second part of it was just in my professional life, and generally I got to a place where I had this question, there must be more to life than this. I had ticked all the boxes, or I thought I had ticked all the boxes. I didn't have the fulfillment, the feeling of fulfillment and happiness that I wanted in my life. Like, there must be more. Like, what's missing? And I was 35 at that time. And I was like, if, let's say, I have half of my life left, the next half is going to be pretty boring and predictable. Is that all there is? There must be more. So that's how I started my journey, quest, or whatever you want to call it. And then I came across this partnered sexuality, spirituality, mindfulness practice called orgasmic meditation. So that was my first thing that I started doing. And it's essentially a focus practice. It's an attention focus practice, but it includes sexuality in it. In that you're focusing your mind, you're meditating almost in a very dynamic field, which is sexual energies, because sexual energy is very volatile, right? Wise people say that it is one of the most powerful energy on this planet. And it is also something that as humans, we have very little skill to work with. And it's always remains a mystery and taboo and all sorts of things. So when I started doing that practice, after a while, what happened was I started to connect to myself better. And we talked about the feedback loop. It creates this feedback loop between two people where the other person becomes a mirror, and you start to learn how you are showing up in connection with other people. So you end up learning a lot about yourself. And that's how it became more of like a spiritual path to me. It's only in a few years after I started doing it that I realized, it's almost like a spiritual path, because I'm becoming more self-aware. I'm opening up myself, like I'm more embodied, or I have more empathy and those kind of things. And how I show up with people, how I show up in my relationships, how I show up even, with my family, or generally with people, that started to change. How I looked at life, how I looked at a lot of other things, that started to change. So it felt like a spiritual path. And then when you read about spirituality and so like, yeah, it is spiritual. So that's how I kind of like got into it. And that's why I think that everything is spirituality. It's not that you somehow stumble upon spirituality. It's different phases, I think. I think the difference sometimes happen. What we notice as spirituality is what we call wake-ups in some circles. It's like you suddenly realize, I've been sleeping.
Awakening.
Yeah. It's like there's this way that world appears to be a certain way, but there's more to it. There's this invisible curtain, and once you peek through the curtain, it's like, oh my God, there's this amazing world behind the curtain that I wasn't aware existed. And I think a lot of the time people call that spirituality or a spiritual path.
And I almost feel like there's no going back. Once you take a peek through the curtain, you only want to go through. And as we were saying earlier, right? the only way out is in, the only way out is through.
Yeah. Yeah, it's you once you're there is no going back. Yeah, for sure.
I guess then let's touch on more on this practice.
Orgasmic meditation.
Yeah. Could you explain how can one practice it?
Okay, so it's a partnered practice. So first of all, you can't, I mean, there's loads of other practices you can do, but this particular practice is a partnered practice. It's a 15-minute practice where one partner who could be a woman, but someone with the clitoris, dresses from waist down. I don't know if this is okay for your audience.
Let's just keep going.
Edit it if you want.
Yeah.
But they undress from waist down, lie on a what we call a nest, but it's basically a blanket, and the other partner remains fully dressed, sits next to them, and strokes a very particular spot on the clitoris with the tip of their finger, up, down for 15 minutes with no goal. That's the practice. And the idea is that there's a particular spot on the clitoris which has more than 8,000 nerve endings. It is the most sensitive part on a human body. And through that, you create a feedback loop, a connection between you and your partner. And over a period of time, it becomes almost like a meditative practice within the sexual field, within the sexual energy field. So it's like you're not trying to avoid anything. You're going into that field and exploring what comes up.
Mm. And how often do you do it in a couple? What's the sort of regimen?
There is no set regiment as such. But it is done as a practice, as if you are doing your meditation practice or your yoga practice, for example. The idea is that you include this in your life. And it could be, if you're a couple, it could be, 2-3 times a week. It could be a daily practice. It totally depends on how you want to do it. And the idea is that you keep it separate from your sex life. So you actually introduce this practice as if you are introducing something new, some new practice in your life for 15 minutes.
What are the benefits of doing this practice in a couple?
Quite a lot, actually. There's been some scientific studies as well lately. So part of it is just the meditation, in that it puts you into a deep meditative state. That's one. There is also a awareness of conditioning, cultural conditioning that we have as the masculine feminine conditioning that shows up in the practice. So you can use this practice as a way to decode that and learn about how you're showing up in connection with each other. And it's a very structured practice. So one of the ideas is that it has, it has a very well defined protocol, which is what you can call masculine structure. Within that structure, you allow 15 minutes of chaos, 15 minutes of feminine energy, connection. You feel intimacy. So you allow that whatever needs to come out, comes out. Benefit, I think for me personally, I think as I said earlier, there was a moment when I realized that I had a body below my neck. And it was through this practice. There was a moment where I realized almost like my body was like, like an hourglass. And I literally felt like the sand was coming down from my head into my body, and I became aware of my body in a real visceral sort of sense. And that awareness, I always go back that particular moment where I became aware and conscious of that that how much of my life I had spent just in my head, just in rational logic sort of sense. That was one thing. The other thing for me was like there's a way that in connections, especially in romantic connections, intimate connections, I was very much living in my fantasy world. When I was with people, I would be in my head. I would be fantasizing about certain situations as opposed to being present in the moment. And through this practice, I learned how to be present in connection, like to the level where I could feel each and every, like I can feel electricity in that connection between people. I can feel, the way I described it, I could feel like each and every cell in my partner's body just being present with them. You know, my relationship to sexuality completely changed. My relationship to people, to connection, intimacy, relationship to myself. Like I became more aware of, as I said, how I was showing up in connection and relationship, not just romantic connection, but even how I was showing up with people at work, with my family. My connection with my mother completely changed. I remember this moment where I asked her, I was on this journey and I was realizing how possessive I was with people. You know, I was in this relationship where I was really possessive with my partner. And I was like, why is that? I was, trying to understand that. And I called my mom once and I said, I'm struggling at the moment. I'm realizing how possessive I am. And she said, oh, you've got that trait from me. And I didn't think before then that I could ever have that kind of relationship with my mother, that I could talk so openly about these kind of things. And from then on, our relationship completely changed. How, we were able to talk about pretty much anything and everything. So in that way, like my entire life got transformed as a result of this practice.
How did you hear about this practice?
So the founder of the practice, Nicole Daron, she gave a TEDx talk that I heard, and I didn't straight away relate that to a practice, but then a friend of mine started doing this, and they were like, "Oh, have you heard of this thing?" I was like, so I put two and two together, and that's how I found out about it. And it was very early days in the UK. It was about 2012 that this practice was starting out here.
And how, I guess that was kind of your first big thing that kind of helped you in your path.
Yeah.
Did you build up on this practice with other practices?
Yes. So what I learned through this practice is, and this might sound a little woo-woo, but I learned that how we manage energy is really important. So how we, let's say, flood our body with energy, how we metabolize that energy in our body, and how we get rid of, let's say, impurities from our body in terms of energy. So one of the things that I learned was a threefold practice, or the idea being that flooding, metabolizing, and clearing are the three stages that we have to do with our body. And there are different practices you can do for each of those. So flooding, for example, orgasmic meditation is a great practice for generating energy. So flooding your body with new energy. Any kind of connection, good food, all those kind of things. Sex, generative sex, because sex can be generative as well as, releasing. Most of the time when we get into any kind of sexual act, quite often it's actually about releasing energy as opposed to generating. But sex can be quite a generative thing too, if you do it consciously and with intent. So what I learned was there are all sorts of practices that you can have for each of these three stages. So you can have a set of practices that are flooding your system with energy. You can have a set of practices that help you metabolize and digest that energy in your body, and then the set of practices that help you clear any impurities. So, for example, as I said about flooding, orgasm, meditation, connection, this kind of thing, and then for metabolizing or digestion, movement is great. So yoga is a great metabolizing practice. Any kind of conscious movement, like swimming, walking, these are all great for digesting and metabolizing. And then in terms of clearing, meditation, journaling, any kind of writing practice that lets stuff out of your head, or self-awareness based practices are good for clearing any gunk from your system, any impurities. So like this particular thing made me aware or expand into a lot of things. So now when I look at practices, I look at it from those angles. Like, oh, okay. In my life, I tend to have some practices that cover all three areas. But they quite often change over a period of time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I never really thought about this way. But I guess it's like not in my world, that's not woo to say we all have energy. I guess maybe for some people it is.
I don't know what kind of audience you have.
This podcast is about being as woo as we can, so it's
Okay,
very
great.
welcome here.
Let's go there then.
I want to talk about sexuality more with you, because
Let's do it.
you mentioned that sex can be releasing and generative in terms of energy. How do we perform it in a way that is either generative or releasing?
Have you ever had a time where you were intimate with someone and there came a moment, I'm not sure if you're conscious of it or not, but there came a moment, it's like, okay, I'm done. But you kept going.
Maybe.
Right? So there's this moment where we live in a climax addicted society. And I mean that not just sexually, but generally energetically. So what is climax? Climax is a release of energy, right? We build up, we expand, and then it gets uncomfortable and we release. In sex, climax is ejaculation. You go on a peak and you hit the peak, and then that happens. In life, we do things like, so for instance, any big things happening in your life is like a climax. You know, you're studying for an exam. You finish your exam, it's climactic, because you're building energy for an event, and that event happens, and then you climax. Similarly, let's say marriage can be a climactic event, which feels weird. However, you're building energy towards this massive event, and then you go through it, and then you're like, oh my God. Holidays can be climactic, right? It's like, so in our I think in our culture, we're addicted to that. We build energy and then we climax it, right? A generative way of living is being conscious of that, in that you don't release it. You can release it if you want to, you know, in lots of like tantra practices, for example, you don't release, you don't ejaculate, for example, and you build your capacity to hold that energy in your body. So one of the things that happens with sexual energy is that sexual energy is basically life energy. It's creative energy, right? But we don't know how to channel it. So as we cultivate this energy, we become uncomfortable, and there's no other way but to release it. That's the only thing we know. But when you learn to channel that energy, when you learn how to hold that energy in your body, you can learn to expand and channel it in whichever way you want.
Are you talking about sexual transmutation? Yeah.
Exactly. That's one way of doing that. So sexual transmutation is learning how to cultivate that energy and channeling in whatever way you want to channel it, instead of a unconscious releasing of energy through climax, right? So when we talk about generative versus a climax-based sex, generative is you go in with the intention of creating energy. Both people are conscious of that, or at least one person is conscious of that. And you go into that and you know at what point you've peaked and you leave it there. There's no goal. And that's how you can use that as a generative, in a generative way. And anything can be generative. A conversation can be generative. There are moments where when you're talking to someone, you're like, I think we're peaked. And you know that. But we keep talking because we want to be polite. Or if we say to someone, and the thing is, the other person also knows that it's peaked. But then we are just like in the conversation with no juice.
Yeah. It's very draining.
It's very draining. So that's where it becomes not a generative exercise. So there's this concept in orgasmic meditation that you change the stroke when it peaks or just before the peak. So the energy always goes in this kind of like peaks and troughs. And that's what you're doing. So if you can move with the peaks and troughs, that's where the practice is. That's where the mastery is. And that's true in everything in your life. In conversations, in generally living your life, in relationship, in sexuality, in intimacy. Every moment is that. Recognizing when you are on the up peak versus recognizing when you're in the down peak without value judgment.
Can we transmute the sexual, and how do we transmute it into a different field of work that we want to focus on?
Well, I think you have energy in your body and you use it to create a painting. You use it to deliver a project at your work. That is transmutation. Instead of releasing it, you held that energy and you channeled it in something. You can channel it in creating a business. You can channel it in your life in whatever way, in sports. Like it's how you use it. That's what channeling is. So transmutation really is holding that energy, not in a tight way, but expanding yourself in such a way that you can increase your capacity to hold more and more energy, which comes from this threefold practice that I was talking about, is that the more you do the flooding, metabolizing, because it's the metabolizing that expands you. The more you metabolize, the more you flood, the more you metabolize, the more your energetic body will expand. And when you can do that, then you can learn how to channel it, how to hold more energy and channel more energy. And that's how you build power.
Wow, there's so much there to think about. That's very, very interesting.
Yeah.
So what do you tell to people who feel like energy drained? Or, I don't know, maybe they're tired from work, tired from household duties, whatever. What is like, do you recommend they go straight away into an energy generative exercise or a practice?
It's, I don't know if there's a set answer to that. It really depends what's happening in their life, like one of the examples could be that if genuinely, so there's this idea of energy accounting, energy out, energy in. After everything you do in your life, you can be conscious of, did that leave me with more energy or less energy? And if you can start to do that kind of accounting, you will know after work, I'm drained because I have given more energy than I've taken, so I need to do something to generate energy. So that could be one of the ways you can do it. Quite often, though, I think and this is a counterintuitive concept, in that quite often we feel drained because we're not utilizing the energy that we have in our body.
Wow. Okay. So how do we utilize it properly then?
Well, first of all, you got to become conscious of that that's happening. In that, quite often we feel tired because we are holding that energy in as opposed to regularly channeling it. So quite often the fatigue is not as a result of being well used, but it's a result of clamping down. And you will know that in your life. If ask yourself this question, do I feel well used? And you will know the answer. If you do feel well used, then you need to do more of generative stuff. However, if you are feeling fatigued or tired for any other reason, then it's quite likely that you actually have to speed up, that you have to actually use the energy more and well, as opposed to cultivating more energy. And there's a subtle but really important difference.
Wow. I feel this way with exercise,
Yeah.
I sometimes feel tired when I didn't exercise, and I feel like I have this energy stored. I don't want to go running or doing yoga
That's
or something. That's when I feel like, oh, I don't feel so good in myself because I know I have this energy storage that I just want to release.
That's it. That is exactly it. Because that energy, it becomes, it kind of like, it's just sitting there, not being used. That's not a good thing, and that's where we become more lethargic and more tired. For me anyway, I look at myself and ask myself when I'm like, oh, tired, it's like, oh, am I tired because I've really done a lot of things that I feel well used in my body, or just lazing around and I haven't used energy well?
I also feel this way with food, because if we put food that's not really healthy for us, technically that's energy, but that's almost a draining energy, because when you have an unhealthy meal, you feel a bit lethargic, you don't feel that good. That's paradoxical, because you're putting calories, you're putting energy in yourself, but you're not full of energy.
Could be, yeah. Could be, yeah.
In the spiritual practices and communities and religions, abstinence and celibacies are used as spiritual practices. What is your take on abstinence as a spiritual practice?
I think anything done consciously can be good. I feel all of it for me comes down to the threefold practice, and it's all phases. For example, so I was in an open relationship for a while, and there came a point where I realized that I was using that as a way to feed my addiction for attention, right? And it became something that wasn't generative for me. I didn't realize it straight away. It took me a while because it felt like it wasn't fulfilling me. It wasn't feeding me in the same way as it used to at one point. And so in that way, like when I realized that, I changed something to see, okay, what if I change this? Will that be more fulfilling? Will that be more of like a, not just empty calories, but actually gives me nutrition and hydration, right? So I feel that with a lot of these things, abstinence or, like non-ejaculatory practices, understanding why you're doing that and using it as research is how I look at it. Everything is a research. Like for instance, for a while, a long time ago, I did this practice where I wasn't masturbating for a while, right? Like, or I wasn't ejaculating. So mindful masturbation kind of thing. I did that for, there's this thing in Tantra, for example, that you don't do it for 21 days, or lots of people actually don't do it at all, and if you don't know how to channel energy well, it can be pretty hard, because what you're doing is you're holding a lot of energy in. You're flooding your system, but if you don't know how to metabolize it and how to clear things and how to channel that energy, then it can be quite uncomfortable. So you gotta go understanding why you're doing it and understanding how to then, is it sort of beneficial for you, and how to channel that energy in is probably the more important thing. And then, do research, see what works for you, is how I see it. You talked about sexual transmutation. Along with that, there is also the idea of sexual alchemy, right? When people talk about sex magic. So our bodies are heat generating systems. We're a furnace. So the idea of sexual alchemy is that you can take anything in and convert into love or gold. So the highest spiritual practice is take any kind of energy in and convert into love. Right?
Wow.
So I think that's what I say. Understanding why you're doing it is important. And I think if the reason is someone else, the idea of, so one of the ideas in exploring the unknown, exploring uncertainty, exploring out of control, is that we have to feel safe before we can let go. And quite often, I think abstinence can be a way to feel safe. But it really is about control. So we are told the way to feel safe quite often is by either avoiding something or controlling ourselves in a way that we don't engage with the thing that might feel unsafe. But that is us managing the external circumstances to get a sense of safety. But the real sense of safety comes from inside. Like if we have an internal sense of safety, then we can go into the unknown, knowing that we will come out the other side. We will have some kind of experience, sure, but we have this sense of internal safety that we will ride the wave and we will come out at the other end. And that kind of internal safety is like based on ourselves. It doesn't necessarily worry about other people or other people's energy. So I think when we talk about things like abstinence, and I see this quite a lot in spiritual communities where we talk about, be careful who you exchange energy with. Yeah, I mean, there's probably something there. And my sense is it feels more like a sense of trying to stay in control. And not really fully understanding how sexual energy actually works. While abstinence, really understanding that will benefit because of where you are and how to learn to channel energy is a different reason for choosing abstinence as example. So I would differentiate there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think like we were going back to self-love and like there is a reason for why you do certain things. Is it to punish yourself or is it to nourish yourself? So I guess it could be also similar here. And then it also comes back to awareness and consciousness. Are you conscious and aware of why you're doing a certain activity? Yeah.
And I think the more intense, the more you go towards intensity, the subtle the work becomes. So it always kind of like it's a continuous research question to ourselves. It's like, am I avoiding something? Or if I lean in, will it be sort of too much, or am I going to go out of my range? So with everything, it is always a an ongoing real time conversation where you're looking at your boundaries, you're in your range, and are looking at whether you know um, you're doing something to avoid. And it's all of it is okay. It's more about just understanding why you're doing something.
I want to divert the topic a little bit.
Okay.
You have an interesting system that you've developed. I think it's called Nibana system. Am I pronouncing
But
it
Nibana is
correctly?
my website. It's nibana.life, and it comes from this. It comes from like the Buddhist word nirvana. It's a Pali translation of nirvana, and it's also equivalent to in Hinduism the concept of moksha, which is liberation or enlightenment. And the idea there is that you got to have three, like, so the idea behind that is that our life here, the souls come to this life to be free and liberated and feel joyous. So we want to be blissful. Our souls want to have the experience of bliss, and that's what we are here to experience or learn how to be in a state of bliss. And to do that, you got to find bliss in three different areas of life. One is how we are in the things that they're called like kama, artha, and dharma. So kama is all our sensual life, sensuality and sexuality. Earth is the meaning, which is our vocation, our relationships, our family, things that give meaning to our life. And the third is dharma, which is our values. And you got to find freedom and bliss in all three areas of your life to find liberation, ultimate bliss. That's the idea. And so the system is more like, through my own experience, I've come up with, what I have gone through. There are four areas I see. One is, we've talked about self-awareness. So it's the idea is, how have we defined our identity? What are our experiences so far in life that we've collected and said, oh, this is who I am. And part of that is things like, how are we with our boundaries? Who are we inside of what we call victim consciousness? What is our social conditioning? What kind of belief system have we built? All of those things together define our identity. So the understanding that, becoming self-aware of those things is one area. The second area is what I like to call like internal skills. So understanding things like masculine, feminine dynamics, like building attention, learning how to cultivate attention, learning what is power, not like real power, not force, but real power, how to move from reactivity to responsiveness in life. So all of those things are more like you build your internal skills. So that's the second area. The third area is more about practices. So for me, there's this idea that we go to workshops, we go to experiences where we have peak experiences. And peak experiences are things where we can see what's possible in our life, what's possible for me. And what happens is we get state addicted to that. But the thing is, when you see what's possible for you, then you have to build the discipline to become that person. And that can only happen through practices. So building whatever your set of practices are, for me, I look at it from a threefold practices perspective. For others, it could be different. But you have to have some kind of practices to become who you want to be, the potential that you see in you. And the fourth is looking at life as infinite game. So play. So there's a set of rules that we have in life that we can move, living everything from a win-lose kind of way of looking at it. Oh, whether it's your job, your life, your work, your relationships, your friendships, everything in life, we look at it as a win-lose. Moving from that perspective to that we are here to play the game of life. And the only thing to do is to keep playing. And that is a concept of what we call infinite game. We play the game to play, to keep the game going. So how do you live everything, how do you do everything as an infinite game in your life? So those are kind of like the 4 pillars of what I have gone through, and I've developed that.
Wow, that's amazing and very comprehensive. I want to touch on the victim consciousness that you mentioned,
Okay.
because I also feel like that's a very hot topic.
Oh, really?
A lot of people are, I think, living in those victim mentalities, like everything is happening to me, this is bad, I'm the victim. How do you step out of it and actually take accountability?
Yeah. I would say that if you are on any kind of spiritual, sexual exploration path, there is like you got to have a solid foundation. And part of that solid foundation, one is understanding your boundaries. And boundaries are like how can I love people, and how can people connect with me? So where do I stop and you start, right? Like that's the boundary, and understanding how to communicate where my boundaries are so that the other person can win with me. That is important. That's crucial in building a solid foundation, because this path is not easy. This path is, it will take you to places where you lose yourself. So you got to understand, have a good sense of your boundaries. Second is victim consciousness, which is very much about like life is happening for me, not to me. That is the basis of it. So, and if you don't understand that victim consciousness concept, as you say, we end up in this place where life is happening to me. One of the things I say is we live in a victim rewarding culture. You will see everywhere in the media, everywhere, if you present yourself as a victim of something, you are given you're put on a pedestal, and our ego is then elevated. So it's very difficult to come out of it. We get stuck in that victim, rescuer, and perpetrator. Those are the 3 things in victim consciousness, the drama triangle. So we just like move in those 3 places. And to come out of that, you got to learn how to move into what we call observer consciousness, where we can detach ourselves from there and start to see that life is happening for us and not to us. Not easy, but it's a practice. It's a lifelong practice. But you gotta have that if you are exploring any kind of spiritual, sexual path, because that builds. Those are the 2 things that, along with what I said about how you define your identity and conditioning, etc. But those 2 things are crucial for you to have a solid foundation on which you can start your exploration journey.
What helped me with stepping out of this mindset is seeing things as a lesson. So even if I'm in a very hard situation, I always see, what kind of lesson can I take? I think that can be a very good way to kind of step out of this step by step.
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it, for sure. Yeah. Like what for me, I've been. Sometimes it's really hard to get out of that victim consciousness because your whole identity is tied into that, and some way of stepping away from it and say, is there a way that I wanted it to happen this way? It's a really hard question, especially when we go deep into some of the trauma areas. It's really hard to be able to see. It's like, I'll give you the simple example. Last year, this is not very intense, but relevant in that how we create our reality. You know, like we went on a holiday last year at a friend's place, and for a while I had this thing that I wanted to change my watch, right, my Apple Watch, and I went into like I there was a swimming pool in my friend's place, and I started swimming, only to realize that after swimming my watch stopped working, and I was really upset for a while. Like, oh my god, Apple Watch is supposed to be, waterproof, at least while swimming. And then I realized for a long time I've had this thought that I wanted to get a new watch, and I hadn't done anything about it. So my subconscious created this thing that now I had no choice. It was like, now you're going to go and buy a new one. And I know it's a silly example, and there's a way that I knew at some subconscious level that I created that reality. You know? So I think something like that is available pretty much every moment in our life. It's sometimes really hard to detach from this dramatic, like, why is this happening to me? You know? And to be able to like step away from that and take responsibility. Like, oh my God, maybe there's some place maybe I wanted to have that experience.
All right. I suggest we stop here.
Okay.
Kapil, it's been eye-opening on all levels. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. And I've blabbered a lot. Hopefully there was something interesting in there.
There was a lot. There's a lot of very, very interesting takes. So thank you very much again.
Thank you.